Want to stay up to date with everything that's happening on the show? Or do you have a story that you'd like to submit for one of our Listener Stories episodes? You can get in touch with the show via the website at www.hauntedukpodcast.com, on Instagram at hauntedukpodcast, on X at hauntedukpod, or you can email us at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com. We're also on Facebook and TikTok. And if you want to support the show, you can do it via either Patreon or Ko-fi. Both platforms have exactly the same content, but work in slightly different ways. One of the advantages of Patreon is its sleek user interface. But if you want to avoid those pesky additional charges that Apple, Google, and Patreon apply to your subscription, then why not give Ko-fi a try? Simply open a browser window and type ko-fi/Haunted UK Podcast, and you'll soon find us. Whichever platform you choose, we're sure you'll enjoy the bonus content. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the episode. Between the years of 1865 and 1901, the United States saw unprecedented economic and industrial growth. During this time, an area referred to as the Berkshires in the state of Massachusetts became the primary location for the country's wealthiest families to build country estates that would rival many of the UK's manor houses in both stature and size. These estates, despite their grandiose nature, were referred to as the Berkshire Cottages due to their primary function being summer houses. Many of these homes hosted lavish events attended by the highest of high society figures at the time. Over a century after the Berkshire Cottages' heyday, echoes remain of former inhabitants who aren't yet prepared to leave their grandiose, gilded age homes behind. This is Haunted UK Abroad, and in this episode we explore the fascinating, sometimes scandalous stories, mysteries and hauntings of the Berkshires, their famous cottages and the people who occupied them. After the turn of the century, and in the decades that followed, especially with the arrival of commercial air travel, many of the wealthy families who had summered in the Berkshires for decades migrated to other destinations. Several of the estates located there fell into disrepair or were converted into hotels and museums. Such is the case for Ventford Hall, a mansion built in 1893 on an 11-acre lot in Lenox, Massachusetts. The Berkshire Hills served as a backdrop for the massive 28,000-square-foot mansion, which was nestled on 26 acres of beautifully landscaped gardens. It featured 50 rooms, including 9 primary bedrooms, 10 servants' bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, 17 fireplaces, and several modern accommodations, such as an elevator and a bowling alley. Prior to the construction of Ventford Hall, the site was the location of a small house which was moved to a lot across the street to make room for construction of the estate. That small house was owned by the Haggerty family, who had named it Ventford, which is French for strong wind. The Haggerty's daughter Annie married and spent her honeymoon at the holiday house, only for her husband to tragically become a casualty of the American Civil War 77 days after the wedding. He was buried in a mass grave in South Carolina, alongside his fellow fallen soldiers. Annie spent most of her remaining years in Europe, returning home for the final year of her life. She died in 1907 and was buried in a nearby cemetery with her mother and sister. George and Sarah Morgan, who was the sister of famous financier J.P. Morgan, purchased the small house from the Haggertys and renamed it Bel Air, after moving to its new location across the street. Bel Air coexisted alongside Ventfort until it was destroyed by fire in 1965. After the Morgans' eventual deaths, Ventfort Hall was rented to none other than a member of the Vanderbilt family, Margaret, who had lost her husband in the sinking of the Lusitania. She resided at the mansion for a year, after which it was sold a couple of times. After the Morgans' eventual deaths, Ventfort Hall was rented to none other than a member of the Vanderbilt family. Margaret, who had lost her husband in the Lusitania, resided at the mansion for a year, after which it was sold a couple of times. Starting in 1945, Ventfort Hall went through a series of changes in use, ranging from a dormitory for music students, a ballet camp, summer hotel and artists' retreat, playhouse, and eventually a dormitory for a controversial religious community. This carousel of inhabitants carried on until the early 1990s, when a developer made plans to demolish the structure to build a nursing home on the lot. In the years that ensued, the home sustained substantial damage, including a partial roof collapse. But in 1997, a non-profit organization was formed to rescue the property. They repaired the damage before transforming it into a national museum of the Gilded Age. The house itself appears to have held on to echoes of its past, as spirits tethered by love and grief remain within its walls. Accounts of paranormal activity began around the same time as the renovations. Countless witnesses reported hearing the echo of footsteps within its vacant halls. Doors creaking open by invisible hands, the scent of a delicate perfume drifting through the air, and whispers emanating from the dark corners of the mansion's many rooms. There are even reports of full-body apparitions drifting down the corridors and looking longingly out of the home's many windows. Some speculate it is the spirits of the Morgan family who have returned to their summer home on an eternal retreat. Others believe it is Annie Haggerty, still grieving for her husband, or her soldier husband pacing the halls wondering what happened to his home, searching for his wife of 77 days. Or maybe it's the ghost of Margaret Vanderbilt, who spent her initial years as a widow at Ventfort Hall. In all likelihood, it's a combination of several of these figures central to the home's history, as well as some who were perhaps simply passing through when it was a dormitory or a hotel. In nearby Stockbridge, Massachusetts, Joseph Hodges Choate, who was once a notable New York City solicitor and an American ambassador to the United Kingdom, commissioned a 44-room country estate along with his wife, Caroline, who was an artist and women's education advocate. They named the estate Naumkeag and hired notable landscape designer Fletcher Steele to craft the surrounding expanse of gardens, which include a rose garden, afternoon garden, and a Chinese garden. Naumkeag eventually became the home of the couple's daughter, Mabel, a recognized horticulturalist, traveler, and art collector who maintained its integrity. It is thanks to her more preservationist side that the home still contains the Choate family's furniture, their collection of Chinese porcelain, and an impressive collection of artwork from America, Europe, and the Far East. After Mabel's death, Naumkeag was deemed a National Historic Estate, and to the trustees of reservations under which it operates as a museum. Of the 700 gardens designed by Fletcher Steele, Naumkeag is the location of one of the only 2 remaining, and it is the only one open to the public. It was visitors to the mansion-turned-museum and gardens who first reported paranormal activity, such as ghostly cigar smoke suddenly appearing in some of the rooms, disembodied footsteps, and even unearthly screams for which they have no explanations. Apparitions have been seen sitting in the drawing room, or ambling through the gardens, and most disconcerting of all, a ghostly woman's head with no body descending the grand staircase. Stately homes weren't the only structures being built during the Gilded Age. Industrial and commercial advancements in the mid-1800s created a need for transportation connections between Massachusetts and Vermont. So a project was put in place to build a 5-mile-long tunnel through the Hoosac Mountains. The name of the mountain range comes from the Mohawk tribes who originally inhabited the land and translates to the stony place. In total, the tunnel took 24 years to build, and its complex and deadly construction process claimed the lives of nearly 200 workers, earning the nickname the Bloody Pit. One of the most tragic accidents occurred in October of 1867 when a candle ignited combustible fumes that had accumulated in the partially built tunnel. This caused a massive explosion and subsequent fire that shot up an external tunnel known as the central shaft, which then collapsed and killed 13 workers in the tunnel below. Shortly thereafter, rumors began to circulate among the surviving workers. They could hear painful moans long after there was any chance of survivors, and ghostly miners would be spotted regularly both in the tunnels and outside, particularly on misty, foggy, or snowy days. By the 1870s, the tunnel was a prized research location for paranormal investigators. One of these investigators was Dr. Clifford Owens, who enlisted one of the workers in charge of drilling to join him on an expedition into the tunnel. He described the tunnel as being dark as a tomb, with the only light emanating from their lamps. Suddenly, they heard a strange moan rise from the depths of the tunnel and noticed a bluish light coming toward them from the darkness. As the light approached, they were able to make out the form of a workman, but as it drew nearer, they noticed with horror that the figure had no head and was floating half a meter off the tunnel floor. The apparition came close enough that they could have reached out to touch it, but they found themselves too frozen in fear to do so. The men and the ghost stayed motionless for a moment, as though assessing one another. Then the apparition carried on down the tunnel before vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. A few years later, a man named Frank Webster was out on a hunting expedition in the wooded area near the tunnel when he went missing. A search was organized, eventually finding him several days later, frozen in complete shock. When he finally got his wits about him, he told a story that shocked the rescuers. As he was nearing the tunnel, he began to hear strange whisperings and voices and found himself drawn into the tunnel as though hypnotized. Inside the tunnel, several ghostly figures grabbed hold of his rifle and used it to beat him. He did indeed have multiple cuts and bruises and no rifle when he was found. It was only 1 year after this incident that a railroad employee who was supposed to deliver wood to a nearby home was seen running away from the area at breakneck speed in a full panic. He was never heard from again. In the years that followed, the tunnel saw several improvements made. One of the issues that needed to be remedied related to the toxic exhaust fumes released by the burning coal that powered the train engines. The tunnel became so hazardous that at one point passengers were dying of asphyxiation. This led to a fan being installed in the early 1900s once electricity was available. At one point, dynamite was used to blast out a room for work crews to use. Over time, this space at the heart of the tunnel became a haven for train hoppers and vagabonds, people with a nomadic lifestyle who would hitch train rides to travel to and from various destinations. This earned the nickname of the Hoosac Hotel, a title that has stuck to this day. The room is located in the same spot where the tunnel had collapsed decades earlier, taking the lives of over a dozen workers in the process. Adding to its haunted feel are relics of the past, such as a desk, chairs, and outdated communication equipment. Over the years, there have been countless reports of apparitions, disembodied voices, bluish lights floating through the tunnel, strange winds whipping up out of nowhere, and of course, the deep, pained moan of the cursed men who were crushed after the explosion and subsequent collapse all those years ago. Locals know better than to go exploring the tunnel, and outsiders are warned to proceed with caution. Back to another of the Berkshire Cottages now, Chesterwood, which was built at the end of the 19th century in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Chesterwood was the summer estate of famous American sculptor Daniel Chester French, whose most famous sculpture is a giant rendering of Abraham Lincoln, which sits at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Daniel Chester French initially purchased the 150-acre farm on which he built a studio next to the original farmhouse. The studio continued to be his primary workspace for the remainder of his career. A few years later, he commissioned a replacement for the farmhouse, which still stands today. After Daniel's death from a heart attack, which occurred at Chesterwood in 1931, the estate was inherited by his daughter, Margaret, who had served as a model for several of his sculptures. Daniel was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. Not long after his passing, Margaret established a foundation in his name to manage 79 acres of the property, keeping the remaining acreage for herself. The parcel was eventually acquired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and an additional 50 acres were added to their portion of the estate. Whilst Chesterwood itself is not reported to be haunted, one of Daniel Chester French's statues housed at a different location allegedly is. The Black Angel statue in Council Bluffs, Iowa, was commissioned by the daughters of a woman named Ruth Ann Dodge, who died in 1916. It is said that in the 3 nights preceding her death, Ruth Ann had dreams in which an angel appeared to provide comfort to her. To honor this, her daughters enlisted Daniel Chester French to create an angel sculpture. A woman named Audrey Munson was hired to model for the sculpture. Audrey became famous for modeling and posed for countless works of art throughout the United States during her career. Despite her success and popularity, Audrey spent her twilight years living in poverty and relative obscurity. Her final years were spent in a psychiatric hospital. Upon her death, reports of the sculptures she had posed for being haunted started to surface. Witnesses have reported the Black Angel sculpture's eyes shifting to follow them as they walk by, whilst others claim to have seen the angel lifting off its pedestal and taking flight. In 1916, Andrew Carnegie purchased a sprawling 100-room mansion called Shadow Brook that at the time was the second largest private residence in the United States. Strangely enough, the estate was never inhabited by the same family for more than 7 years at a time, which some believed was due to a curse placed on the land by its original indigenous inhabitants. Prior to Carnegie taking up residence at Shadow Brook, it had served as a hotel for 2 years. Papers at the time sensationalized the owner's swift exit as being caused by sorcery, legends, and lore attached to the property. Whilst on some level this may have been the case, it is worthy of note that the owner at the time became embroiled in legal trouble, which cost him a large portion of his fortune in legal fees. After Andrew Carnegie's death at Shadow Brook, his widow essentially abandoned the property in favour of their Scottish residents, Skibo. She eventually sold the estate a few years later to a religious group who turned it into a seminary for 150 students. It was during this era that an explosion in the boiler room caused a fire that destroyed the mansion and killed 6 of its residents in the process. Today, the site features some of the original outbuildings and a sprawling house that was built to replace the original mansion. The estate is now used as a yoga, health and wellness retreat, perhaps contributing to rebalancing the energy of the supposed curse placed on the land more than a century ago. The Berkshires aren't only known for the haunted houses and apparitions, they are also a hotspot for unexplained phenomena, cryptids, and legends. One of these legends comes from the Mohican natives and involves the highest waterfall in the state of Massachusetts. The falls are named after a woman named Bashbish, who, upon being accused of adultery, was said to be killed in a terrifying way. The plan was to tie her to a canoe and send her over the edge of the falls, dropping 60 feet down to her death. When she woke on the morning of her execution, she found a thick cloud of butterflies fluttering around her. She used their cover to escape and jumped down the falls of her own volition, never to be seen again. Bashbish's daughter, who was named White Swan, was set to marry shortly after her mother's disappearance. Soon into the marriage, it was discovered that White Swan was infertile, so her husband took on a second wife who could provide him with children. White Swan was devastated and made her way to the falls where her mother's spirit summoned her to join her in the water. White Swan went over the falls and, like her mother, was never seen again. Over the years, countless hikers and visitors have reported seeing the silhouette of a woman behind the falling water. It is perhaps coincidental, but the falls have also claimed over 25 lives in recently recorded history. Perhaps those poor souls were drawn to the water by Bashbish or White Swan, joining their ranks as silhouettes behind the eternally falling water. Bigfoot is often associated with the Pacific Northwest United States, but the Berkshires have tales of Bigfoot sightings to rival those of the West Coast. Sightings of the massive yet elusive creature in the area date back to the mid-1700s, when explorers in the area claimed to have happened upon the creature while it was sleeping. The next recorded incident occurred in 1895, when a local newspaper ran an article detailing a local townsman's account of encountering the cryptid. One of the relatively more recent, and certainly the most famous witness accounts, took place in 1983. A small group of friends had gathered at an abandoned lakeside camp for a cookout when their peaceful surroundings were suddenly disturbed by eerie rustling noises in the distance. The friends grew slightly nervous as the sounds grew nearer. Whatever was causing the rustling, it was something big. They convinced one another that there was nothing to worry about and carried on enjoying their evening. 2 hours went by and the rustling continued. Unable to continue ignoring the sounds, 2 members of the group set off to investigate. They were only about 30 meters away from the camp when they came upon a huge bipedal creature standing in the middle of the trail. The young men raced back to camp, urging their mates to pack up their things. The group got into their car and got the shock of their lives when they turned on the headlights. In plain sight was the creature, this time crouched down in some shrubs. From the safety of the car, they were able to take in more details and noted the creature appeared to be 6 or 7 feet tall, covered in brown fur, and had eyes that glowed in the light coming from the car's headlamps. They commented on how the creature seemed almost, but not quite, human. This was not the only sighting of the creature on what is referred to as October Mountain, a name given by famous local writer Herman Melville to honor the mountain's glorious array of color during the autumn months. A few years after the campers' encounter, a hiker reported a sighting of a large reddish-brown creature crouched in the bush off a popular mountain hiking trail. Curious, he grabbed his binoculars to get a better look, just as the creature stood and moved into a clearing. the hiker's curiosity quickly morphed into fear as the man realized this was a creature like none he'd ever seen. It had many human-like features, but its arms were slightly too long, and it was entirely covered in fur with the exception of its slightly elongated face. The hiker watched as the creature picked up rocks, carefully stacking them into a pile after checking their underside for insects. Once the creature had finished eating, it rose to its feet, reaching a staggering height, and walked towards the woods. At this point, the hiker turned and fled back down the mountain. October Mountain appears to be a hotspot for paranormal activity, as it has been central to not only multiple encounters with Bigfoot, but also ghostly apparitions and UFO sightings. Speaking of UFO sightings, one of the most famous recorded accounts in the US occurred in 1969, when multiple people in and near the town of Sheffield, people who had no connection to one another, experienced something truly and possibly quite literally out of this world. The Reed family were driving home from an all-day event. After a stop at their family-owned diner pushed their arrival home into the later hours, they decided to take a shortcut by crossing a covered bridge dating from 1837 that spanned 28 meters across the Housatonic River. Tom and Matthew were settled in the back seat, with their mother driving and grandmother in the passenger seat. As their grandmother turned to speak to the boys, she noticed an eerie light covering the bridge which they were driving through. They continued to the other side, where upon exiting, they noticed three strange floating objects. The primary object off to one side of the bridge was a sphere of white light that appeared to be shooting beams toward the ground below. On the opposite side of the bridge was another sphere emitting an orange light. Above those was a large metal disc-shaped object. Frozen in shock, the boys' mother stopped the car as they stared on, completely transfixed. Suddenly, a bright, blinding light flooded the car, and everything in their surroundings went quiet. It is at this point that all four of them blacked out. When they came to, the boys were shocked to see that their mother and grandmother had changed seats, especially given that their grandmother never drove. The boys claimed to have vague memories of what happened in that lost period of time, but they cannot account for the entirety of it. The family eventually sold their diner and moved away from Sheffield. Tom went on to become a successful film and TV producer and director, often circling back to the region and the events of that fateful night in his projects. The strangest part of this story is that the Reed family weren't the only ones to witness unexplained flying objects and have eerie, frightening experiences. A local radio station host allegedly received so many calls from listeners who had seen spherical objects landing and taking off from the fields surrounding the town that he felt compelled to call the police. One of the most bizarre reports stemming from the slew of encounters was that of a now locally recognized artist and author, Tom Warner. Tom was 10 years old at the time and visiting a neighboring home when a voice popped into his head telling him he needed to get home, that they were close. Compelled by the command, Tom immediately left and began racing through the fields towards his home. As he was running through a pasture, he suddenly noticed that all noise had stopped. He was surrounded by a stark and eerie silence. Tom continued to run, but soon realized that though he felt as though he were moving, he wasn't making any actual progress across the field. It was like he was running in place. This was when he realized he was trapped beneath a beam of light. Suddenly, his arms jerked behind his back with such violence it sucked the air out of his lungs. Sitting on the porch of a neighboring home, a woman named Jane and her grandmother watched in horror as Tom ran into the beam of light coming from the UFOs stationed above and promptly vanished. It is at this point that Tom says he found himself inside a spherical room that appeared to be floating. He recalls seeing children, lights, a table, and a humanoid figure he could only describe as alien. The remaining details are hazy and disjointed. Tom estimates he was gone for approximately 7 minutes, then he was returned via the beam of light to the field below, where he found himself laying on the ground in the fetal position. Tom could hear his brother shouting to him that he needed to run, but felt as though the beam of light was pinning him to the ground. Out of nowhere, the strange voice in his head arose again, this time to inform him that they would be done in a minute. Sure enough, the beam of light vanished within a minute, and Tom was free. Tom stood and looked overhead to see the UFO above. His eyes followed as it ascended above the tree height and silently flew toward the west. Using his skills as an artist, Tom created several paintings depicting the life-altering experience he had as a child. He has since written an autobiography that touches on his life both before and after his experience that fateful September night in the Berkshires. Though it was the widest-reaching UFO event in terms of the number of reports that came through in one night, this was not the only UFO incident to have occurred in the area. In fact, there is extensive documentation of accounts from many different people, and several from both Tom Reed and Tom Warner, who continue to have otherworldly experiences over the years. Near the Sheffield Bridge where Tom Reed, his brother, mother and grandmother first encountered the UFO way back in 1969, there is a park with a sign commemorating the historically significant incident. The park has become a gathering place for people who have had similar encounters, offering them validation and a place where they can perhaps feel a little less lonely in their experiences. Ghosts and UFOs aren't the only unexplained phenomena in the Berkshires. One estate in particular is allegedly home to an Egyptian curse. Ashton Tully is the former estate of a politician and Egyptologist named Rob de Peyster Titus, who at the turn of the century had an expansive white mansion commissioned that would eventually come to be referred to as the Marble Palace. Titus, who had a passion for archaeology, joined Percy E. Newberry and Howard Carter on their excavations in Egypt, where he helped uncover the palace of King Amenhotep III, who was King Tutankhamun's grandfather. At its peak, Ashton Tully was the site of lavish social gatherings and parties, which saw many recognizable guests come through the door. Yet despite the festivities, the house felt shrouded in a dark, peculiar aura. Tragically, Titus died of tuberculosis at the age of 38, only a short time after the mansion's completion. Subsequent misfortunes afflicted his family, which created a belief in their social circles that their family may have been cursed. Adding to the local whisperings was an incident in which a group of haymakers fell upon a disturbing and unusual corpse while clearing out a barn on the estate. The medical examiner was called in, and it was eventually confirmed that the corpse was that of a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy which Titus had stashed away in the barn until construction on his home was complete. On another occasion, a guest of the house was woken in the dead of night by a voice calling his name. He sat up in bed and eventually was able to pinpoint the voice to a painting on the bedroom wall which had allegedly been stolen from a Roman palace and smuggled into the country. Years after Titus's passing, his wife Grace died in a bizarre accident in which she fell during a game of tennis. After the accident, she had a heart attack followed by a series of seizures, one of which contributed to her death. Only 5 years after that, their daughter Mildred was taken by a car accident while driving to Ashton Tully for a visit. Her car had swerved off the road, crashing into a tree and ejecting her from the vehicle. Rumors began to circulate that the family had angered long-dead Egyptian rulers by disturbing their eternal sleep whilst searching for ancient relics and fortunes. The final nail in the coffin came when the estate burned down in the early 1950s, and from that point on, the idea of the Ashantully curse was cemented. Today, the remnants of the once grandiose mansion sit on the overgrown estate, looking over the surrounding area from atop the hill on which the mansion was originally built. Though the house is gone, the heavy, eerie aura that was once held within its walls can still be felt by its remains. Arguably, the most famous and allegedly most haunted estate in the Berkshires is the Mount, former home of renowned author Edith Wharton. Before delving into the estate itself, it's important to explore Edith Wharton's life and childhood. Edith contracted typhoid fever at a young age and fell deathly ill. She was confined to her bed for weeks, during which she became an avid reader. One of the books she read involved ghostly tales of robbers, which she finished just before a relapse in her illness. When she finally woke, she claimed to have returned from a world haunted by formless horrors. This experience would change the course of her life. From that day on, Edith would say she lived under the shadow of a dark, unidentifiable threat, constantly lurking. She grew afraid of the dark and of being alone, fears which accompanied her well into her childhood. One of her most famous quotes is, quote, "I do not believe in ghosts, but I am afraid of them," end quote. Edith eventually tamed her fear of ghost stories and scary books by becoming a master of writing them. By the time she reached the age of 70, she'd written over 85 ghost stories and was preparing a collection of her best work for publication. Many of Wharton's other stories and novels of a ghostly nature center around the theme of solitude and being trapped alone in a dusty old house filled with secrets and an oppressive silence. This likely stemmed from her own experience at the Mount, a 100-acre estate located in the Berkshires. The mansion was modelled after a 17th-century English country home and sat amongst sprawling grounds which featured formal gardens designed by Edith herself. Adding to the mystique of the estate is a dedicated pet cemetery, where the Whartons' beloved pets were buried. Edith even wrote a story about a ghostly pack of dogs haunting the home where they were murdered. Edith lived at the estate with her husband on a part-time basis over the course of a decade, years which were marred with unhappiness due in large part to her husband's fits of mental instability, leading to their eventual divorce. After the divorce, Edith moved to France, where she lived out her remaining decades. It is speculated that she used her original ghost stories to work through the various fears she had accumulated throughout her life. Many of her hardships are reflected in the stories included in her failed marriage, feelings of isolation, being observed by unseeing eyes, and feeling trapped. After its sale, the Mount went through several different iterations, ranging from a girls' school, a theatre troupe, and even coming full circle to a museum and cultural centre dedicated to Edith Wharton and her own works. Over the years, many inhabitants and visitors reported inexplicable occurrences, ranging from disembodied footsteps and slamming doors to full apparitions in the drawing room and a ghostly maid wandering the halls. Then there are the stables, where it is claimed that Mrs. Wharton's former chauffeur can be heard bidding visitors a good night, and some have caught a glimpse of her husband, Teddy's ghost, watching them with deep scrutiny etched on his face. Guides at the museum have also reported smelling cigar smoke in what was once Teddy's study, as well as the unnerving feeling of someone pulling their hair. Dark figures have been seen lurking in the shadows and crouched in the corners of the rooms. In the upstairs window of what was once Edith's bedroom, the ghost of a woman with gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes stares out at the world, raising questions about the formless horrors that began to appear to Edith after her childhood brush with death. Do they still roam the rooms of the Mount? And have Edith's deepest fears come true and seen her trapped inside the house as well? And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of this episode. If we've learned anything, it's that certain places in the world seem to attract supernatural encounters and paranormal activity more than others, and that being wealthy and famous does not protect one from these occurrences. From a stunning, stately home haunted by an ancient Egyptian curse to a doomed tunnel filled with the tragic ghosts of dead workers and eerie encounters with cryptids and aliens, there is no doubt the Berkshires is one of these places. But what or how do these places become the epicenter of the unexplained and otherworldly? We don't have the answer to that question. But one thing is certain: whether you believe any of these stories or not, if you find yourself driving on a covered bridge late at night, or trudging through a miles-long tunnel blasted through a mountain, or perhaps simply visiting the former residence of a renowned Gilded Age family, make sure you cast a cautious glance over your shoulder once in a while, because the next person to have a haunted holiday could be you.